Video of the two videos we have for chapter 11 is going to go through how we can improve our performance appraisal process. So in the first video, we talked about different appraisal formats like rankings and ratings and management by objectives. So the second strategy we can use is selecting the right raters. In some organizations, we have what we call 360-degree feedback, where different individuals give feedback on a specific employee's performance. Usually those kinds of individuals include a supervisor. They'll include peers or coworkers who work with that person on teams or in departments or on projects. It'll be the person themselves will rate their own performance. We can have people who work outside the organization, like customers and vendors, providing feedback. And we can also have, if that person's a supervisor, the people they're supervising give them feedback on their leadership style. This can be very helpful feedback because by doing 360-degree feedback, there are lots of different people who see different aspects of that employee and the different kinds of tasks they do for their job. The drawback is that this takes a very long time to do. You may have people who are rating employees who don't rate employees otherwise, so they don't have a lot of experience doing it. And then, as our book mentions, sometimes if you ask supervisors, they'll say 360-degree feedback is pretty consistent, but research has shown that it's not always consistent, that some kinds of raters give more positive feedback, and other kinds of raters might give more negative feedback. And then how do you deal with those discrepancies when you're doing evaluations or performance appraisals of those employees? For a lot of companies, customers are becoming a more important part of the appraisal process because customers have kind of become the focus for a lot of organizations on how well they're doing their job. However, even if you have 360-degree feedback, even if you use customer satisfaction as part of appraisal systems, 80% of the feedback that most employees get comes from their supervisor. So that's still the most common way to do appraisals. And then I would say for a lot of organizations, self-ratings are also really common. Everywhere I've ever worked has always had self-ratings. And usually the way this works, if it's not part of the 360-degree feedback, it often will be where you ask employees to do a self-rating before they meet with their supervisor. And then their supervisor can compare their rating with the employee's self-rating, and they can talk about differences between those ratings. That helps the employee understand better how their supervisor is rating their performance, but it also can give them feedback on how to improve their performance as well. For all these systems, the more raters you have, the better. It increases reliability. Our book has a very long section on reliability. You don't need to know the statistics or technical information about how we calculate reliability. That is like graduate level work, not necessary for you to understand that having more people rate can improve your reliability. It can also improve your accuracy because it's more likely that you will get a better look at how different employees are performing when you have lots of different people involved in rating their performance. Our third strategy is that we want to understand how raters process information. A lot of ratings have what we call criterion contamination. This is where things that are not related to performance become factors in how employees are rated, either holistically or within specific scales. So you can have things like performance irrelevant factors like, are you friends with that employee? Our book talks about women and people of color tend to get lower performance appraisals for the same behavior, that sort of thing. That would be performance irrelevant factors. We also have rater feelings. When raters are embarrassed, for example, to give an employee a lower rating on a scale or to give them a lower rating overall, they may be less likely to do it. We also have what we call the halo effect. Some of you might remember this from past classes like organizational behavior. This effect is when we have a positive perspective on a characteristic of an employee that kind of skews or taints our perception of that employee overall. So a really good example or a really common example is when someone is friends with their supervisor or their supervisor thinks that that person's friendly. Even if that person doesn't perform well, they may not see that poor performance or may not think about it as part of that person's performance overall because the fact that they like that employee kind of skews their perception of that employee overall. And I'm sure many of you have seen this in the workplace. It is not an uncommon effect. We also have just a lot of supervisors who often aren't prepared to do appraisals. They've never received training, or in most organizations, I bet, supervisors just don't have enough time to do very good appraisals. And that can lead to a lot of contamination in the criterion because they just don't have time to really do a good job or to think through the whole year, what have these employees done to give a very accurate view of that employee's performance. Changes in performance over time can also affect how raters or supervisors rate employees. A really good example that the book talks about is employees who have done well in the past, but maybe recently have poor performance, are going to be rated more poorly on scales or in their overall evaluation rating than employees who consistently perform poorly, because supervisors are comparing, or raters are comparing, the employee's past performance, which was much higher, to their current performance, which is much lower. And that difference seems much bigger than for people who are consistently poor performers. Raters also tend to recall information in trait categories. This is related to what we call the fundamental attribution error, which some of you also may remember from organizational behavior. This attribution error says that when we see something about someone, like a negative behavior, we will attribute it to something about that person, their own traits, rather than the context in which they're behaving. A really good example is if you have an employee who is late. That employee might be late because there was traffic and they got stuck in traffic on their way to work. Well, a supervisor may remember that the employee's late and then may actually remember that as the employee has poor time management skills, instead of even if they knew it was traffic, the way it gets put into the memory is that it was a trait. And then when they recall it later for the performance evaluation, it's in the it's in that kind of trait context. And so they're not thinking about the fact that there was traffic that day. They're thinking about, wow, that employee must have poor time management issues. And then they might think through, well, where else have I maybe seen that as well? And then the purpose of an evaluation can affect ratings. It's really common, for example, when supervisors know that performance appraisals are used for merit pay or promotions, that they're more likely to be lenient in the way that they rate employees. They're more likely to give all employees higher performance appraisal scores or ratings, because they don't want anyone to be punished. And also, again, that's part of the rater feelings. They may have feelings about that information being used later. So our fourth strategy is training raters to rate more accurately. And we have 3 ways that we can train raters before they start doing performance appraisals with employees. First is what we call rater error training, and this reduces errors by simply making supervisors or raters more aware of the kinds of errors they could be making when they're doing appraisals. If you've ever done unconscious bias training, a lot of that kind of training is the same sort of training where we make people aware of the biases they might have in the way that they evaluate other people or make decisions that they may not have been aware of, with the hope that by making someone more aware of those biases or errors, that they'll be less likely to actually do them or use them when they're making decisions. Our second is performance dimension training, where you simply let supervisors or raters know what the metrics are that are going to be used for performance appraisals. So this gets them at least familiar with what those metrics are. It might get them familiar with using those rating scales as well. The third one, called performance standard training, is the most useful of all of them, at least according to research, for training raters. And this doesn't only expose supervisors to what the performance dimensions or metrics will be that they'll be doing performance appraisals on, but it actually gives them a standard of comparison by going through the scale and talking about what employees at different points in that scale will look like. So what does an employee who gets a 1 on regularly meets deadlines look like versus an employee at 2, 3, 4, 5 on that scale? So this is actually getting supervisors or raters to start thinking about how they're going to do that appraisal, that performance appraisal, and what that will look like in terms of behaviors that they're looking for employees. The most common error, and the reason that a lot of organizations are redoing or even sometimes getting rid of their performance appraisal systems, is that there's a lot of leniency in the way that supervisors and raters are doing performance appraisals, meaning that lots of employees get similarly high scores. And because this is the most common error, it shouldn't be surprising that it's also the most difficult one to eliminate, especially if, even after this training, if raters know that these systems are being used for important decisions, they may continue to have leniency errors in the way that they do performance appraisals for nothing related to the actual way that appraisals are done, but more to the feelings and thoughts they have about the way the system is used. So our fifth strategy is improving rater motivation and opportunity to rate more accurately. So one way that we can reduce some of those errors, or especially leniency errors, is by doing calibration sessions. So this is when managers or supervisors will do draft performance appraisals. They'll write up their performance appraisal for each employee. Then they'll come into a meeting with other managers who are also doing performance appraisals with their employees. And then they go through each employee. They talk about how they rated that employee and why they did. And then managers give each other feedback on whether those performance appraisals ratings, for example, should be changed based on the evidence or behaviors that that manager is describing for why they're giving that particular employee a certain score. This improves consistency across supervisors. So you can imagine sometimes supervisors always are lenient. That's just the way they rate people. There can be other supervisors who are quite strict. And what this does is reduces the differences between employee performance appraisal ratings for those who have lenient supervisors versus those who have strict supervisors, so that those employees with a strict supervisor aren't always getting lower performance appraisals, even if they're actually performing quite well compared to their coworkers who might have more lenient supervisors in terms of the way that they rate their employees. That consistency can also improve the accuracy of the performance appraisals, in the sense that it's much easier for us to differentiate than employees who have better performance, who should have higher appraisal ratings, than employees who have poorer performance and should have lower ratings. So there are lots of ways that we can improve the appraisal process. These two slides go through some of the recommendations in our book. One is that we need to determine our key factors for measurement. So what are the key performance indicators or the metrics that we're going to use to develop our scales? We need to make sure our job descriptions are up to date and that our employees know what's expected of them. Because if they don't know what's expected of them, then that means they're not actually working toward getting high performance appraisal ratings, which theoretically, those appraisal ratings, if we're trying to determine key factors, are related to our organization strategy. We want to have informal discussions throughout the year with employees about their progress, how they're doing, giving them developmental feedback, but also we want them to be able to come to supervisors or managers and tell them when they're hitting barriers that may be preventing them from performing well, because part of that manager's job or the supervisor's job is to reduce those barriers or eliminate them completely so employees can get their work done. We want to focus on the behaviors that employees are actually performing and not on the people themselves. So that's where that kind of thinking about different kinds of behaviors as trait characteristics of employees is not helpful. What we want is supervisors who can write down specific behaviors that they've seen or specific results that they've seen from that employee that helps us determine whether that employee is performing well or not. We want to involve employees in every stage of developing performance dimensions and building scales, because they're the ones that are kind of on the front lines. They're the ones doing those jobs, but they're also the ones who can help understand what it looks like to not perform well and to perform well in the tasks that they have to do as part of their job. We also want to train our raters, and we want our employees to understand how our system operates. What will this look like? What will performance appraisals look like? And what will they be used for? If we're going to use them for merit pay, for example, our employees should know that as part of being transparent, but also so they understand what are the consequences when you don't perform well in the organization. We want raters to be motivated to rate accurately. One way is to have calibration sessions, for example. Another way that a lot of organizations have been doing in recent years that has some research that backs it up is making managers justify their ratings, like writing some narration about what are the behaviors that you saw this employee perform that made you rate this employee on this scale a certain way, or overall that the overall performance rating, why did that employee get that particular rating. Raters should maintain a diary of employee performance that they're updating regularly. Part of this is for documentation if you have to go to court for discrimination, but part of it is just to jog your memory when you're doing performance appraisals, especially because we often only tend to remember things that happened more recently, closer to that performance appraisal. And we often forget things that might have happened earlier in the year, but are still important for us to be considering when we're thinking about employee performance. For when employees aren't performing up to standard or when they're performing poorly, we want to be able to diagnose what is the issue. Is this a motivation issue? Do they need some training and development because they don't have a particular skill they need to do the tasks in their job? Is there something like an external environmental constraint that's preventing them or creating barriers for them to perform well? being able to diagnose what the reason is that an employee didn't perform up to standard helps us figure out what the solution is to help them perform better in the future. And then we want to give timely feedback to employees. A lot of managers are now trying to give feedback almost immediately to employees when they see someone doing something really well, or if they see that there might be some improvement that could be needed in a particular behavior, instead of waiting until the performance appraisal meeting, once a year. The last topic I wanted to talk about in the slides, and there's more in our textbook than what I've covered in the slide deck, is equal employment opportunity and performance appraisals. So one reason that we learned about all those laws before we started talking about how you actually develop a performance or an internal pay structure is that a lot of the processes that we develop and that we implement in the workplace are influenced by these laws. So when we think about the performance appraisal system, to think about how fair is the system, we want to think about, are similarly situated individuals treated similarly in our system? So if we have individuals who are performing quite well, they're doing well in the tasks in their job, are they getting the same kinds of rewards as other employees who might work in another department who are also performing similarly well in terms of the tasks or the metrics that they have to meet for their performance appraisal? Or are they being treated similarly? Are some people getting like the same performance appraisal scores or ratings, but then some individuals are getting more merit pay for those same scores than others, simply because we have some issues with fairness around our system. That sounds like it should be pretty obvious, but actually a lot of organizations have discovered that not all individuals, for example, are rewarded similarly for the same performance ratings. And so this is actually an issue for a lot of organizations. So when we think about discrimination specifically, because a lot of times what happens is if employees think that their performance appraisals are unfair, they may actually file lawsuits against the organization, their employer, for discrimination. There may be something not related to their performance that is affecting their performance ratings that should not be there. And especially if it's characteristic, or if they think it's something related to like their gender or race or some other protected characteristic within the law, then they can go to court for discrimination. Courts consider performance appraisals like pre-employment tests in the sense that there has to be some proof that these performance appraisals tell us something about an employee's performance. Courts tend to like when specific written instructions are available on how to actually complete appraisals, whether it's just supervisors or even if you have a system like 360-degree feedback where you have to explain to people how to do these performance appraisals. You want an appraisal system that incorporates clear criteria for evaluating performance. So that's where developing scales can be really helpful. Excuse me. You want job descriptions that are adequately developed so that employees know what the tasks are that are part of their jobs, and then what will be the criteria for evaluating their performance on those tasks. You want feedback to be required as part of the performance system. You want ratings that are reviewed by a higher level manager, and you want consistent treatment across raters. These last two, that's where calibration sessions can be really helpful. You could also have 360-degree feedback to just get lots of different kinds of feedback from different people to meet these criteria. But if we think about all of these criteria and developing our system, it's much more likely they'll be fair and they'll be defensible in court should an employer ever have to go to court for a discrimination suit in terms of their performance appraisals.